It is Friday in the year 1103. The Emir of Hims, Jana ad-Dawla, is walking into the great mosque for prayers. His enemies are numerous, so he is taking no chances. He is completely surrounded by a wall of his most elite, hand-picked royal guards, fully armed and shielding him from the crowd. As he reaches his place of prayer, an old, frail man, dressed as a pious, peaceful ascetic, approaches the formation. The guards hesitate. You don't draw swords on a holy man in the middle of a crowded mosque. That single second of hesitation is all it takes. The old man and three others instantly draw concealed daggers. They bypass the elite guards and brutally stab the Emir to death right on the prayer floor. The assassins don't run. They don't try to escape. They simply stand their ground, taking down the Emir's guards until they themselves are killed. Absolute chaos erupts. Without a clear leader, the Emir's army knows they're a sitting duck. Rather than wait to be slaughtered by rival Emirs or Crusader sieges, they abandon the city and flee to Damascus to beg for asylum. This wasn't a random attack. This was a surgical, psychological strike. These men were known as fidais, and for the next 150 years, they were going to paralyze the greatest empires on earth. To understand who those men in the mosque were, you have to look at the mastermind who forged them, a brilliant, ruthlessly logical Persian scholar named Hasan-i Sabbah. Hassan wasn't a general or a warlord. He was a radical religious missionary and a hunted political exile. By the year 1090, Hassan had a vision for a new, purified Islamic state. But he had one massive problem: the Seljuk Empire. At the time, the Seljuks were the undisputed superpower of the Middle East, a dynasty of Turkish warlords who had conquered everything from Iran to Syria. They ruled over the local populations like an armed occupation. More importantly, they were fierce defenders of mainstream Sunni Islam, and they viewed Hassan's radical Shia sect as a plague that needed to be eradicated. Hassan had no land, no army, and an empire of hundreds of thousands of soldiers hunting him. To stand a chance, he needed an impenetrable base of operations. He set his sights on Alamut, a fortress perched so high in the treacherous Elburz Mountains that locals refer to it as the Eagle's Nest. Alamut was held by a Seljuk lord, heavily garrisoned, and practically impossible to take by force. So Hassan used patience. Months before he ever set foot on the mountain, Hassan dispatched his dais, highly trained, fanatically devoted religious agents. Operating in total secrecy, they quietly infiltrated the surrounding villages and the fortress itself. They didn't just talk to the garrison, they preyed on their grievances, weaponizing the local soldiers' hatred for their Seljuk overlords. Slowly, they converted the garrison to Hassan's cause, one soldier at a time. The lord of the castle, Mahdi, eventually smelled the rot that had grown within his walls. In a panic, he purged the suspected converts, exiling them from the fortress and locking the gates. But the Dais were masters of deception. The expelled soldiers stayed at the gates, swore their undying loyalty, and claimed they had been framed. Mahdi hesitated. Isolated and needing guards to man his walls, he made a fatal mistake. He opened the gates and let them back in. Once inside, the trap snapped shut. They quietly smuggled Hasan-i Sabbah himself through the heavy stone gates. He lived quietly in the shadows, directing the final takeover from within. When Mahdi realized he had been played and ordered the garrison to arrest the intruder, they simply refused. He was a lord giving orders to ghosts. The castle was no longer his. In the ultimate display of cold, calculated dominance, Hassan handed the defeated lord a promissory note for 3,000 gold dinars, bought the fortress out from under him, and let him walk away. Without spilling a single drop of blood, Hasan-i Sabbah had just captured the most impregnable fortress in the Middle East. But sitting in Alamut, Hasan knew he had a math problem. He had a few thousand followers, and the Seljuk Empire had hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He couldn't fight them on an open battlefield. He needed a secret weapon. So he created the Fidai. In Arabic, Fidai translates to one who sacrifices himself. These weren't common murderers. They were highly disciplined operatives, driven by an absolute, terrifying religious devotion. To the Fidai, dying in the line of duty wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was a sacred act to purify their souls. They didn't wage war on common soldiers or peasants. They exclusively struck the great and the powerful. And they almost never used poison. Poison leaves room for doubt. A dagger, on the other hand, delivers a haunting message. The goal wasn't just to kill a single ruler. The goal was to make every other ruler in the empire terrified to go to sleep. The Seljuk Empire did not ignore the theft of Alamut. By 1092, they had mobilized to crush Hasan-i Sabbah before his rebellion could spread. The man who ordered the strike was Nizam al-Mulk. He was the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire, a brilliant statesman, de facto ruler of the Middle East, and Hassan's ultimate political and ideological enemy. Nizam sent a massive force to lay siege to the Eagle's Nest. Hassan was trapped, outnumbered, surrounded, and running out of supplies. It was finally time to test his new weapon. Hassan selected a single Fidai named Bu Tahir Arani. His mission was simple, suicidal, and practically impossible. Travel to the vizier's royal encampment and cut off the head of the Seljuk Empire. In October of 1092, Bu Tahir infiltrated the massive military camp. He didn't sneak in under the cover of darkness. He dressed himself in the coarse wool of a Sufi mystic, hiding his dagger in his clothes. In the 11th century Middle East, Sufis were wandering, impoverished holy men. They were universally revered. To draw a weapon on one was an insult to God. The Fidais understood that the best way to bypass a wall of guards wasn't to fight them. It was to wear a disguise that made the guards lower their weapons out of respect. Furthermore, they knew the Grand Vizier was a deeply pious man who made it a point to listen to the petitions of the poor. So, Bu Tahir simply played the part. Holding a piece of paper like a desperate beggar, he calmly approached the most powerful man in the Sunni world. The guards parted for the holy man. The vizier reached out to take the petition. In a flash, Bu Tahir dropped the paper, drew his blade, and buried it in the vizier's chest. The guards immediately tore the assassin to pieces, but the damage was already done. The death of Nizam al-Mulk fractured an empire. Without their Grand Vizier to hold the different political factions together, the Seljuk leadership instantly collapsed into a brutal civil war over the throne. The massive army besieging Alamut simply packed up their tents and went home to fight in the succession crisis. Hasan-i Sabbah had defeated an army of thousands by killing one man. The strike was a terrifying, undeniable success. The age of the Hashashin had begun. With the Seljuk leadership collapsing into civil war after the vizier's death, Hasan-i Sabbah was free to expand. But he didn't build a conventional empire. He built a ghost empire. The Hashashin didn't take fields, farms, or cities. They sought isolation. Across Iran and Syria, they targeted impenetrable mountain peaks, creating a decentralized network of heavily armed fortresses known as the Dar al-Hijra, the domains of refuge. They were entirely outgunned in the valleys, but they owned the sky. And from those mountains, they spread terror. The assassination of the Grand Vizier had completely rebalanced the rules of power. Suddenly, having a massive army meant nothing, if you couldn't trust the people standing next to you. A suffocating paranoia infected the Middle East. Emirs, generals, and viziers began wearing heavy armor under their clothes, even in the blistering heat. They stopped allowing petitioners to approach them. They locked themselves in their palaces and slept surrounded by hand-picked guards. But even that wasn't enough. The Fidais were famously patient. They would infiltrate a royal court and spend months, sometimes years, working as loyal servants, scribes, or even bodyguards, just waiting for the command from Alamut. You could never be sure if the man pouring your wine was just a servant or a ghost from the mountains waiting to purify his soul. One Seljuk Sultan, Ahmed Sanjar, finally decided enough was enough. He organized a massive military campaign to once and for all wipe the Hashashin off the map. Hassan didn't send an army to stop him. He sent a single operative to bribe one of the Sultan's most trusted inner circle. One morning, Sultan Sanjar woke up in his heavily guarded, locked royal tent. Sticking out of the hard earth next to his head was a dagger pinning a note to the ground. The message from Hasan-i Sabbah was clear. If I did not wish the Sultan well, the dagger which was struck into the hard ground would have been planted in your soft breast. The psychological damage was devastating. The Sultan was so utterly terrified that a man could bypass his entire army and stand over him while he slept, that he instantly called off the military campaign. He didn't just make peace with the Hashashin, he actually started paying them a massive annual pension just to leave him alone. Without ever leaving his mountain fortress, Hasan-i Sabbah had successfully taken the entire Sunni ruling class hostage. What he had built wasn't just a kingdom, it was a blueprint. Modern military historians study the Hashashin as one of the earliest recorded examples of state-sponsored asymmetrical warfare, essentially the invention of terrorism. But there was one significant difference between them and modern terrorists. They believed killing innocent civilians was a sin. Instead, they exclusively terrorized the people in charge. By the mid-12th century, the Hashashin had expanded far beyond Iran. They established a deadly new foothold in the mountains of Syria, right in the middle of the Crusades. The man who took command of this Syrian branch was Rashid ad-Din Sinan, a leader so legendary that the Crusaders simply called him the Old Man of the Mountain. Sinan operated with the exact same ruthless mathematics as Hasan-i Sabbah, and he needed it because he was facing the single greatest military commander of his age, Saladin. Saladin was the undisputed champion of the Sunni Islamic world. He was building a massive empire to drive the Crusaders out of the Holy Land, and he viewed the Hashashin as a treacherous knife at his back. The paranoia was entirely justified. Hashashin operatives had already tried to assassinate him twice. The first time, operatives infiltrated his winter camp and triggered a massive brawl, taking several of Saladin's top commanders with them to the afterlife. The second time, they got even closer. Disguised as his own men, an assassin stood right next to the Sultan and drove a dagger straight at his head. If Saladin hadn't been wearing a hidden chainmail coif under his headgear, he would have died on the spot. The blade deflected, slashing his cheek, leaving Saladin bleeding while his guards hacked the assassins apart. So, in 1176, Saladin marched his massive army to the mountains and laid siege to Sinan's stronghold. Sinan didn't fight the army, he sent a ghost into the camp. According to the chronicles, Saladin was famously paranoid. He slept in a specially constructed wooden tower with hand-picked guards who watched over him 24/7. No one could get in. But one night, Saladin woke from a restless sleep to find that the lamps in his room had been blown out. And resting right next to his head was a poisoned dagger with a note pinned to his bed. Beside the dagger were hot scones, baked in a distinct shape used only by the Hashashin. The message was clear. We are in your room. We are watching you sleep. If we wanted you dead, you would be. The psychological break was absolute. The greatest warlord of the 12th century panicked and believed the old man of the mountain possessed dark magic. He immediately ended the siege, packed up his army, and marched away. He never attacked the Hashashin again. Later, they would even become allies. But Saladin wasn't the only one terrified of the Hashashin. The European Crusaders fighting in Syria had no idea what to make of them. They couldn't understand the deep Shia theology or the political nuances. All they saw were phantom killers who struck in broad daylight and welcomed death with a smile. What they did know was that local Syrians referred to the sect using a derogatory Arabic slur, Hashashin, roughly translated to hashish eaters. It was a way of dismissing them as crazy, lowly outcasts. They dragged the word back to Europe, but because they couldn't pronounce it, it mutated to what we know today as assassin. They stripped away the history, the theology, and the brilliant psychological warfare, leaving behind nothing but a crusader myth about drugged killers, and a brand new word for murder. They survived Seljuk sieges, crusader invasions, and brutal civil wars, because no matter how massive the enemy army was, their leader was still a human being who had to sleep. But in the mid-13th century, a new, terrifying enemy arrived from the east. An enemy that could not be intimidated, the Mongol Empire. Led by Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, the Mongol horde was sweeping across the Islamic world, demanding absolute submission. The Hashashin recognized the threat and tried their standard tactic. They dispatched a massive kill team of disguised fidais all the way to the Mongol capital to assassinate the great Khan. But the strike failed. For 150 years, the Hashashin had succeeded by exploiting the culture of their enemies, dressing as holy men or blending into crowded, corrupt royal courts. But the Mongols had their own rules. The great Khan was guarded by an elite, unbribable military guard. They didn't care about Islamic holy men, and a stranger in a disguise couldn't just walk up to the Khan's tent. The assassins were discovered, tortured, and executed. Hulagu Khan decided the sect was a nuisance that needed to be exterminated. In 1256, he marched his massive army directly to the gates of Alamut. The Hashashin retreated behind their impenetrable mountain walls, expecting a standard siege. But the Mongols brought Chinese engineers and massive siege engines capable of shattering mountain stone. For the first time in their history, the Hashashin looked down from the eagle's nest and realized that the people at the gates could not be stopped. Realizing that their style of warfare was completely useless against the horde, the Grand Master of the Hashashin surrendered, hoping for mercy. But the Mongols did not negotiate. Hulagu Khan executed the leadership, slaughtered the fidais, and dismantled the legendary fortresses stone by stone so they could never be used again. Finally, he set fire to the massive library at Alamut, burning a century and a half of Ismaili history, theology, and secrets to ash. In a single, ruthless campaign, the Mongols didn't just defeat the Hashashin, they erased them. Hulagu Khan thought he had completely erased the Hashashin from history. Physically, he had. The fortresses were rubble, the library was ash, and the surviving members of the sect scattered into the mountains, returning to the shadows. But you cannot burn a myth. While the Mongols destroyed the physical empire, the Crusaders had already carried their myth back to Europe. Decades after the fall of Alamut, a certain Venetian merchant named Marco Polo traveled through the region. He heard the local legends and wrote highly exaggerated accounts of the old man of the mountain, claiming the killers were drugged with hashish and brainwashed in secret gardens of paradise. It was a mix of crusader propaganda and local campfire stories, but Europe was captivated. Before Hasan-i Sabbah, the world didn't even have a dedicated word for the targeted murder of a political figure. Today, that ghost empire is everywhere. If you've ever played the first Assassin's Creed game, you've already walked through this history. The game's castle, Masyaf, was their real-world Syrian stronghold. The mentor character was based directly on the Old Man of the Mountain. A massive, multi-billion-dollar pop culture franchise was built out of the exact Crusader myths Marco Polo brought back to Europe. But the historical reality is far more terrifying than any fictional story. They weren't super soldiers or magic mystics. They were a mathematically precise insurgency built by a brilliant, ruthless scholar who solved an impossible problem. Hasan-i Sabbah realized that he didn't need hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight an empire. He just needed a handful of devoted men, clever disguises, and the cold understanding that underneath the armor, the crowns, and the armies, every invincible warlord is just a man who eventually has to go to sleep.